So first things first, I just wanted to say that this originally was not the plan, as in I was going to do this on my main channel the same way I did the LeBron and Kobe video and the Michael and LeBron video. I was going to do a Kobe and Duncan video over there, and I was really doing my homework. I was reading some of the older books that I had, some of the sections on Duncan and Kobe. And through it all, and I was taking my notes, I was like, it's actually pointless to do that type of video, because if you've watched those, you see that I do hard comparisons, and by the time I get to the end, I have a hard reason for why I think one player is better than the other. But when I'm thinking about Kobe and Duncan, man, this is just way more difficult than that. And I actually compare it to a conversation that you would have about Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. And one of the reasons you've never seen me really talk about that, and one of the reasons you've never seen me make a video about that, is because they were just both so damn great that I don't even have an answer for who's better between Larry and Magic. I don't have that answer. I know Magic was the greater winner, but who's the greater player, who's the better player? Man, that just gets really confusing, and that's similar to how I feel about Kobe and Duncan. These are both 2000s players, so I grew up watching both of them, and I've seen the conversations and the narratives change all the way from 2005 and 2008 to 10 years later where we are here in 2018. And it's where I honestly believe that, and this doesn't reflect what I believe right now, but I think that Tim Duncan has become a Kobe Bryant hater's favorite player, especially for guys who didn't really see them both play, or they didn't see both of their primes. And the people who base everything off of numbers, it's very easy to go for Tim Duncan. It's like a low-hanging fruit to just put Tim Duncan over Kobe. For people that want to rank Kobe as low as humanly possible without sounding dumb, the people who really want to put him at the bottom or maybe even out of the top 10, Tim Duncan is one of those players that they desperately want to put in front of him. And despite where you might think I'm going with this, I'm not about to tell you you're wrong. I'm also not about to tell you that I 100% agree with you. Because I'll just go ahead and put the black and white statement out there right now. I think that Tim Duncan definitely had the greater career, and I think that Kobe Bryant was the better player. Because when you look at it from a career perspective, there's no way really to argue that Kobe had a better career than Tim Duncan. They both got the same amount of championships, regardless of how it happened. They both got the same amount of titles, but then Duncan has more finals MVPs, he's got more regular season MVPs, he's got a Rookie of the Year award, he's got more all-league selections, so arguing that Kobe Bryant had a better career than Tim Duncan, that's an uphill battle. But that's why I made this a barbershop talk, because I just wanted to kind of talk about these two players and what I saw and what the kind of conversations are surrounding them, and just generally just put out there what I think about Kobe Bryant and Duncan. They've become such an interesting comparison because they were dominant around the same times. Obviously LeBron James came in at 2003, so that was a good like 5 years later than Kobe Bryant, or 8 years, however long it was a little bit later, and they never actually played in the playoffs, so there was never a rivalry there. But Kobe and Duncan, on the other hand, saw each other 6 times in the playoffs, and they were both at the top of the league at the same time. Much easier to just look at and ask, well, who was the best player of the 2000s? And I really love their comparison because they are so polar opposite. They couldn't be more polar opposite if you tried. So they play different positions, so that makes it a little bit difficult. But then you talk about how Kobe is way more flashy and had the controversy and the drama around him. And Tim Duncan was accused of being boring for most of his career. There was no flash to it. There was no drama. He was always just the perfect model teammate. And that already opens up a conversation by itself, because it's like, Duncan being the perfect teammate is part of the reason where, you know, people always say, well, Duncan had the luxury of playing with a great coach his whole career, or playing with, you know, good teammates his whole career. And that's something that people say sometimes to try to not tear Duncan down, but make his accomplishments a little bit less relevant. But then you're looking at it and saying, okay, well, that is totally by design, because the reason that Kobe Bryant had 2 or 3 years of total strife where he was playing alone and he was losing was really because of his attitude and how he didn't mesh with Shaq. It was both him and Shaq, it was both of their attitudes, but he played a big part in that as well. And also not getting along with Phil Jackson. You know, there was a whole thing where it's like, a lot of that was Kobe's fault. And the whole thing that happened with Tim Duncan, from taking pay cuts to never really arguing with the coach, never arguing with teammates. You never hear anybody say, you know, or tell bad stories about playing with Tim Duncan. It was just a really easy guy to play with. And that's why for his entire career, he was always in contention, because he was always on a team that he was helping to become and stay as great as they were. So there's no question that Duncan has him beat there. There's absolutely no question if you know anything about either of these players. But that's also where I think that it's where I say, okay, if you have Duncan on a great team with a great supporting cast, you're always going to hear about Tim Duncan every year, and they're always going to be near the top. Because that's just the type of guy he is, and he's going to help push that whole thing forward. But I think Kobe is the guy that no matter if he was playing for a great team or if he was playing for a terrible team with Smush Parker and Chris Mim in the starting lineup, you're going to hear Kobe Bryant's name, and you're going to hear him at the top of the league regardless of the talent around him. And that's where I definitely think it goes back to what I said earlier about him definitely being the better player than Tim Duncan was. Because my suspicion is that if you had Tim Duncan on a team that wasn't as great, that didn't have an amazing system, that didn't have good teammates around him, if you put him around a Smush Parker and then you put him around a Kwame Brown, I'm not saying Tim Duncan is not going to get his, but then I'm not sure if you're looking at him at the top of the league every single year. But that's also a very, very difficult position to prove, because we never saw Tim Duncan really with a terrible team. We never saw him with a bad team. The worst position that we saw Duncan in throughout his career was probably around 2002 when he had guys like Danny Ferry and David Robinson was hurt and certain guys weren't producing in the playoffs. Tony Parker and Steven Jackson were having a tough year. But we never saw him around just terrible players where you just question if they should be in the league or not. So it's a hard position to take because technically there's not any proof for it. But while we're on that topic, I just wanted to go ahead and say that my praise for Tim Duncan is a lot greater than you have ever heard. And I'll say that nobody really knows, because if you follow my Twitter or even YouTube, you notice I've never made a Duncan video. I've never really mentioned Duncan like that. And I fall right in line with the majority of NBA fans, because I think that his career, no, not his career, the perception of his career suffered heavily from being in San Antonio. Because up until around 2014, the stereotype was that the Spurs play boring basketball, which is completely false, and that's always been false. I just want to tell you that. But back when they were winning the championship in 2007 against the Cavaliers and in the Pistons series, I believe that was a very low-scoring finals. I actually believe that finals against the Cavs was like the lowest rated we had in the 2000s, or it was definitely very close. And it's because they always did the right thing. There was no singular focus on a Kobe Bryant or LeBron James, or you know how we look at teams and we always say that's that guy. Well, with the Spurs, it was just passing, cutting, plays. It was just fundamental basketball, and people weren't really feeling that. And so I heard this statement, and I can't remember where I read it or where I heard it, but the statement was that if Tim Duncan's exact career, the points, the rebounds, the accolades, if his exact career took place in a city like New York or in LA, they think that Tim Duncan would be widely considered top 5. And that's a whole nother video, that's a whole nother conversation, but I do want to say that his resume warrants a lot more credit than it actually gets. Because if you look at what he did coming into the league and how consistent he was, Tim Duncan has got to be the most consistent superstar of all time. He came into the league averaging 21 and 11, 21 points, 11 rebounds, 2.5 blocks, played all 82 games, shot 54% that first year. And if you just go down the row from there, from his rookie year all the way down about to the mid 2000s, it's the same thing every single year. There's very little variation in his numbers. The Spurs were always competing. Tim Duncan was always putting up around 22 points, always around 12 rebounds, every single year, playing defense, being a great teammate, all the time. And on top of that, he showed up in the playoffs every single year. Whether they won or lost, Duncan always had his part. He always had his part in the elimination games. I believe in the closeout game against the Nets, he damn near had a quadruple-double. And the reason Duncan is so interesting to me is because if you look throughout his whole career, his whole playoff career, there's not a moment where you look at it and say Duncan just choked. There's only one. There's one moment where you say Duncan choked, right? And I don't even know, I haven't seen people killing him for it. I've never seen this like a popular narrative around the internet, but in 2013, Game 7 against Miami, when he missed that layup, that was, I guess that's what, if that would have happened to LeBron or if it would have happened to Kobe, people would have been all over the internet calling it a choke. So we'll call that Duncan's one choke for his entire career. But you don't have an example where you can say, oh, the Spurs lost because of Tim Duncan. He played bad in this elimination game. He didn't show up. Hell, I remember in Game 6 of that year, in 2013 against the Heat, he was having a crazy game where he was, off of that one game alone, I believe he was about to take home Finals MVP. If they would have beaten the Heat that night, Duncan was taking home Finals MVP. He was putting up that type of night. And the craziest thing about that is he was 36 years old when that happened. And this was, I would say, about 2 or 3 years past when people thought he was done. When you get to around 2010, 2011 specifically, people thought Duncan was done. That was his worst year as a pro. He averaged 13 points and 8 rebounds, and if I'm not mistaken, that was the year that the Spurs got put out in the first round by the Grizzlies in 2011. Is that what happened? They didn't get close to winning, I know that much. And that's where people just said Duncan is done. And then he improved and came back and won a championship and almost repeated. So then that's really difficult in the context of this conversation, right? Because when you talk about Kobe, we can look at a lot of things. We can look at 2008 Game 4 actually. Game 4 when they were trying to tie the series against the Celtics and blew that 20-point lead, and Kobe had a terrible game. You can look at when they had a 3-1 lead against the Suns that you could argue that they shouldn't have had anyways, but when he didn't take a shot in the second half, a lot of people think that was him trying to prove a point. He defended himself by saying that they didn't do well against the Suns when he came out and just pulled the ratchet. I think most people hold that against his career. That Game 7 performance against the Suns, pretty sure 06, whichever year that was, pretty sure most people hold that against him. But you know the thing about Kobe Bryant, in this day and age when we're getting further and further away from his prime, and we're getting into this stage where a lot of people who didn't see him are having more and more of a voice and more of a say on how we're looking back at his career. The thing is, they're very happy to talk about all the negative stuff that happened in his career, but they don't ever talk about the things that are second nature for somebody like me to talk about who saw him play because they didn't experience it. So often they're trying to put somebody over Kobe, they're trying to rank somebody over him, or just say that he wasn't that great overall, he doesn't deserve to be in the conversation with this, that, or the other player, so they're only looking at the negatives. But okay, let me take you back to a time in mid-2000s, or as we were ending the 2000s, right? From that stretch from 2007 to 2010. You know the thing that gets me is that every night when you knew you were going to play Kobe Bryant, you knew your team was playing Kobe Bryant, the question wasn't, we weren't sitting there saying, yeah, man, I hope Kobe Bryant shoots his team out of the game tonight, or yeah, you know, I can't wait to see Kobe shoot 10 of 25, or whatever it is that kids say these days about his field goal percentage. We weren't trying to figure that out. We were trying to figure out how to survive that night, how our team was going to survive an attack from Kobe Bryant. And that's what always gets me in the Kobe and Duncan conversation, because now we can just look back at numbers and all these things and we can create conversations based off those. But when it comes down to it, when we were in the 2000s, Duncan was an amazing player, and of course he was on the scouting report, and of course people were wondering how we were going to stop him. But you didn't have the fear of Tim Duncan that you had of Kobe Bryant. You weren't trying to figure out how you were going to avoid being slaughtered by Tim Duncan in the 2000s. You were trying to figure out how you were going to avoid being slaughtered by Kobe Bryant and his wrath and however he psyched up his teammates to go against you. That's what you worried more about back then. And there's just so many conversations that lack context these days that make it very easy to look at what Tim Duncan did in his career and say, oh yeah, he's easily greater than Kobe Bryant. He easily ranks above Kobe Bryant. You know, that word easily, I hate when people do that. When they're talking about legends and they just say one guy is easily better than the other. Like, how do you just easily say somebody's better than Kevin Durant, right? But that's another conversation. Going back to where I was discussing context, somebody who doesn't like Kobe or is trying to push a narrative will go to a year like 2010 and they'll say, oh, Kobe was only shooting 45%. Or they'll look at the finals, especially they'll look at the finals and they'll say, against the Boston Celtics, he only shot 40%. Pau Gasol deserved MVP. It was Gasol's work. They should have gave Gasol Finals MVP. And the people who weren't around back then don't understand simple things like how Kobe was playing that season and that series with his finger wrapped up like a goddamn tortilla because it was broken. This man took the time to learn instead of just sitting out like most people would have and missing months of action and coming back out of shape or whatever. He learned how to shoot, not really using that finger as much as he normally does. Do you realize how difficult that is to do, to change your shot mid-season and still win a championship? Getting your knee drained because you got problems there? Those are the things that people don't look at. And if these same people looked at Kobe's injury charts throughout the 2000s, I think they would understand why people like me hold him to such a great esteem. Because the numbers can say whatever they're gonna say, but you look at the numbers he put up and the things he accomplished with the way his body was feeling and the amount of games that he was playing and participating in Team USA. When you combine all those factors, that's why people are still looking at it and saying, yeah, Tim Duncan has all this, but we saw what Kobe did during the 2000s, and we can't just go off of the Finals MVPs and the MVPs and just automatically go, you know what, yeah, I'm still putting Duncan up there, because they remember being more fearful of Kobe Bryant and his teams than Tim Duncan and his teams. That's what they remember if they actually watched it. And so being a Celtics fan, I had a front row seat to that finals in the, not literally, but I'm saying that how I was watching it and observing it, the 2010 NBA finals. And, you know, despite what the numbers say, Kobe not shooting that well. And then of course there is the game 7 where, yeah, his legacy almost died that night because of the way he was shooting. But in the bigger picture, back then, before the whole narrative about his field goal percentage started, a lot of us weren't looking at Kobe falling for the traps of the defense that night and taking all those shots and saying, yes, he's falling for it. No, we were sitting in fear of the ones that he might hit because of the killer instinct that this man had. And now I see this thing where people don't even believe in killer instinct anymore. I've had people ask me, Dom, what is killer instinct? What is that? And those are the people that just did not watch Kobe Bryant play. Because killer instinct is when he was facing up Ray Allen closer to the end of the game when the Lakers were taking back momentum after the Celtics had lost their lead, and Kobe had shot piss poor by that point. But killer instinct was not caring that he was shooting poorly. He still went for it, and I believe that extended the Laker lead to about 4 or 6. Whatever it was, Boston never recovered, and that's what you were so afraid of when you were going against Kobe Bryant back in those times. And then the thing that really gets me is people talk as if Kobe Bryant never had to go through that level of competition, like he never had to play the Spurs. And that typically happens when they're talking about LeBron's competition in the finals, and I specifically saw Kobe responded to that one on Twitter where they were like, oh, you know, you put Kobe on those Heat teams, he never had to play a guy like, he never had to play the Spurs or whatever he said. They had to play the Spurs 6 times. Kobe and Duncan went against each other, if I'm not mistaken, 6 times in the playoffs, and the Lakers won 4 of them. And then immediately people go, oh, well, Kobe had Shaq. Well, a couple of things there, or a few things there. One, the Spurs also had a great team around him, so let's not just act like it was Kobe and Shaq against Duncan. That's not the truth. Second, the reason the Lakers was such a threat throughout the 2000s was not just because Shaq was being dominant, but it's because you also had Kobe on the perimeter that would kill you too. That's what makes them the most dominant duo of all time. And then number 3, they went through the Spurs when Shaq was gone, when they acquired Gasol halfway through the 2008 season, and the Spurs were defending champions. The Lakers beat them in 5 games. Are we just not going to talk about that? We're going to act like that didn't happen? All in all, because I could talk about Kobe and Duncan the entire day, because I was just so into their careers, and you know, they made up such a big part of the dominant teams throughout my childhood. What I would say is, again, back to the original point, I think Duncan definitely had the greater career. Wouldn't argue against that at all. And I just think Kobe was the better player. And as far as when it comes to ranking these players, it's not just as black and white as who had MVPs and who had finals MVPs. And I just cannot describe it, but it was something about watching these two throughout the 2000s. And the people, maybe if you're in the comments and you watch them both play, maybe you can help me, you know, try to articulate what I'm saying. The 2000s just felt more Kobe Bryant than they did Tim Duncan. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that Kobe was in the finals for 7 of those years throughout the decade of the 2000s. Maybe it had to do with the fact that a lot of people thought Duncan's career was over in 2011 when Kobe was still, you know, he was still pretty much at the height of his game around that time. It's just something that when people try to throw these numbers in your face and all these, you know, all these different stats in your face, but you've watched them both play, you're like, you know, I will give Duncan his just due, because he, in my opinion, he is very underrated, and I do believe that if he had played in a bigger market, Duncan would definitely be talked about more, so I agree with that. But there's just something there that when people try to throw those numbers in your face and say that Duncan was the greatest player of the 2000s, and you remember what you saw, you're just like, it's not that black and white, man. We got to talk.